It was the biggest moment of music history that never was. In the 1970s, the Hells Angels attempted an assassination on Mick Jagger. At the peak of his powers, the Rolling Stones frontman was almost wiped out, and the course of music history would have been changed forever. Hiring the Hells Angels. In December 1969, the Rolling Stones organized a concert in Altamont, California. It was at the height of the swinging 60s, and the message of free love and unity was very much in the air. Woodstock had just taken place on the outskirts of New York, so the Stones and other bands organized a Woodstock for the West Coast. At the same time, the Rolling Stones were previously criticized for charging high prices for their concerts, and decided to hold a free concert to help clean their reputation. It was initially introduced as a good piece of PR for the group. The end result was the exact opposite. That summer, the Rolling Stones had their first free concert in Hyde Park, London, and it went off without a hitch. This concert was meant to introduce their new guitarist, Mick Taylor, to their fans. But sadly, their former guitarist, Brian Jones, died shortly beforehand, and the concert became a makeshift tribute to Brian. Upon recommendation from the band The Grateful Dead, the Rolling Stones were persuaded to hire the biker gang the Hells Angels as their security, and when the concert at Hyde Park took place, they seemed to have done a good job, and were hired for their next free San Francisco gig later that year. However, the Stones didn't realize that the Angels were not as good as they thought they were. According to Far Out magazine, the Hyde Park group stood back, drank tea, and largely let the police do any real work. With Jagger so intent on not having any police at the Altamont event, it left only the Hells Angels in charge. The Stones had no idea what they had gotten themselves into. 300,000 music fans came in their droves to a free concert. The Stones had hired one of the most deadly gangs in the US to keep control of things. On top of that, you before could easily assume that many illegal substances were being consumed across the venue. It was a recipe for disaster, and chaos was almost inevitable. Just a shot away. For some people, the hope and optimism of the 1960s died at this concert, and aptly took place in the final month of the final year of the 1960s. The famous writer Hunter S. Thompson wrote, "The Altamont Rock Festival shames my worst fantasies. The Sharks finally came home to roost." Taking the stage before the Stones were Carlos Santana, Crosby, Still, Nash & Young, and Jefferson Airplane, among others. Grace Slick, who was lead singer of Jefferson Airplane and came out of San Francisco's music scene, noticed that something was off. She said, "The vibes were bad. Something was very peculiar. Not particularly bad, just real peculiar. It was that kind of hazy, abrasive, and unsure day. I had expected the loving vibes of Woodstock, but that wasn't coming at me. This was a whole different thing." Grateful Dead were scheduled to appear later in the evening. They sensed the same vibe as Grace Slick and refused to play. There were incidents of violence throughout the day, but nothing that warranted calling it off. And when the sun began to set in the San Francisco outskirts, the Rolling Stones took the stage. The Stones began with Jumpin' Jack Flash, and people were trying to climb up on the stage. A distraught Jagger said, "Just be cool down in the front there. Don't push around." During their performance of Sympathy for the Devil, fights broke out once again, and the Stones had to restart the song. It was during the track, Under My Thumb, that the love and goodwill of the swimming 60s came to a grinding halt. Before the song begins, Jagger tries to calm down the crowd. As the song played, an 18-year-old kid named Meredith Hunter tried to get up on the stage. This was quickly prevented by some Hells Angels who dragged him down. Meredith's motivations to jump on stage are speculated. Some say he wanted to kill Jagger, others say he was just high on drugs. As I'll get into later on, there was much more to Meredith that was initially reported. When the Angels brought him down, Hunter took out a gun. Then, a Hells Angel named Alan Pissarro quickly stabbed him to death. Overlooking what happened, Jagger switched the lyrics of "It Feels Alright" to "I Pray That It's Alright." Fearing their lives and the lives of those in the crowd, the Rolling Stones continued their set list. During their song Gimme Shelter, their lyrics took on a different meaning. Originally about the Vietnam War, Jagger chillingly sang the lyrics "Rape, Murder. It's just a shot away." His lyrics about the fragility of life were now a lot closer to home. The Stones finished their set, ending one of the most horrific concerts of all time. As it turned out, another 3 people died that day. The reputation of the Rolling Stones was in tatters, and when the sun set on San Francisco and the news media came to terms with what happened at that concert, the Rolling Stones had a lot of questions to answer. Their next move was crucial. The blame game. Hells Angels member Alan Pissarro was arrested and tried for the murder of Meredith Hunter. In the aftermath, a blame game ensued between the Hells Angels and the Rolling Stones. Firstly, Jagger sensibly decided that they would never be using the Angels as security ever again. the Stones distanced themselves even further. For the murder trial of Meredith Hunter, the Angels needed $50,000 in legal fees, but the Stones refused to pay for any of it. As far as they were concerned, it was not their responsibility. That being said, they sent $10,000 to Meredith Hunter's family. Even this backfired, as it was described as nominal sum. Rolling Stones guitarist Mick Taylor said, "I think it affected all of us very profoundly. The thing we were upset about was being accused and held responsible for what happened. You can't really blame anybody in that kind of mass hysteria." The band obviously felt horrible about what had happened. At the same time, they were also terrified that the Hells Angels were out to get them. Jagger said, "People would say, 'Mick, aren't you worried?' One time it really got me was after we decided to do the tour. We parked in a parking lot and these 4 girls came up, young girls. They said, 'But aren't you afraid of being shot?' That really freaked me out. You know, they're like 15-year-old girls. So I said, 'Yeah, I am.'" Ultimately, the Rolling Stones had provoked one of the deadliest gangs in the US and were on tour. This meant that there was public information about which city the band would be at a certain time. Touring made an assassination attempt all the more easier. Jagger's response was to simply ride it out. The Stones also heavily increased their security too. It got to the stage where the Stones would book out the entire floor of a hotel where security could patrol and make sure no unwanted visitors go by. The band's bassist, Billy Wyman, said, "Everyone was saying don't eat the food. I said to the promoter, 'Have you tasted the food?' And he said, 'Yes, I've tasted everything. It's all right.'" It was kind of a half joke and kind of a wary thing as well. The Stones had a reputation for partying and living a life of excess, but during this particular tour, they were not allowed to leave their hotel room. All I ever saw was the inside of my hotel room in the concert hall. I was told I couldn't even go out shopping, and I couldn't order food from room service because somebody might slip into the kitchen and put poison in my curry. When you're told things like that, what can you do? And Mick Jagger, the personification of confidence and fearlessness, was terrified. He said, "A few people said don't go. Friends of mine. They said, 'You've really got to be more careful. You can't go.' I said, 'Well, it's more or less what I do, so I got to do it.' There was a few places where it did get scary, and there was a lot of guns confiscated and stuff like that. Don't say I wasn't scared. I was scared shitless." And you'll see just how realistic this fear was. The assassination of Mick Jagger. While Altamont may have been what ended the free love spirit of the 60s, there are other horrifying events that cast a dark shadow over this period. President Kennedy was shot in 1963, and his brother Bobby was later killed in 1968. In the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. was also killed in 1968, as was Malcolm X in 1965. People got assassinated, so it would be unwise for the Rolling Stones to think that they were an exception. The BBC journalist Tom Mangold uncovered something that showed that the Rolling Stones were not being paranoid about their safety, and that the Hells Angels were genuinely trying to kill them. Having spoken to members of the FBI, Mangold concluded the Hells Angels were so angered by Jagger's treatment of them that they decided to kill him. The Angels knew that Jagger had a home in Long Island. In fact, because the UK government introduced extremely high taxes on high earners, this was his permanent home. From what I could gather, Jagger's mansion was out in Montauk, which is right at the tip of Long Island and beside the Hamptons. So Jagger had security facing the front of the house. It was arguably one of the safest places he could be. However, the Angels had a plan. Instead of passing through Long Island and coming out guns blazing, they could sail across from New York by boat and enter the back of the home. So the plan was as follows. The Angels had rented out a dinghy which was filled with men and weapons. They set sail, but they were, for lack of a better word, out of their depth. They had no boating experience, and a storm was brewing across the sea. Sadly for the Angels, and fortunately for Jagger, and for music fans everywhere, nature intervened. According to Mangold, they planned the attack from the sea so they could enter his property from the garden and avoid security at the front. The boat was hit by a storm and all of the men were thrown overboard. All survived, and there was not said to have been any further attempt on Jagger's life. So what stopped the Hells Angels from ever trying again? Pissarro is cleared. In the meantime, Pissarro was on trial for the murder of Meredith Hunter. Much to Pissarro's good fortune, there were cameras facing towards Hunter during the event. Footage showed Hunter taking out his pistol and pointing it towards the stage. Ironically, the Hells Angels could equally be responsible for saving Mick Jagger's life. The jury ruled that Pissarro killed Hunter, but he did it out of self-defense. It's not known whether the Hells Angels tried this again. Through a combination of the passage of time and Alan Pissarro being declared innocent, the Hells Angels and the Rolling Stones stopped being enemies. The most overlooked part of the story is what happened to Meredith Hunter. It's argued that a big component of the matter was that Meredith was African American and was killed by a gang with a history of white supremacism. It's also argued that the whole reason that Hunter had a gun with him was out of necessity, as he was a black man surrounded by white people. The sad reality is that he was just 18 years of age and was mourned by a family that could not afford to buy him a headstone. On that fateful night, Hunter's girlfriend, Patty Bradehoft, recalls when he went back to their car and brought back a gun. She said to him, "Why are you getting that?" And he responded, "It's just to protect myself. They're getting really bad. They're pushing people off the stage and beating people up." The journalist Saul Austerlitz, whose book Just a Shot Away details the Meredith Hunter story. He said in an interview that Alan Pissarro was guilty. We do see Meredith Hunter pull out a gun in the footage, but what witnesses say about what happens after the footage comes to an end when Hunter's gun is knocked away is scary. Rather than acting in the way another more professional security force might have done, putting him in handcuffs and taking him away, they essentially pull Hunter out of sight and continue beating him until he dies. Altamont was seen as the end of the swinging 60s. It was seen as a cautionary tale for messing with violent gangs. But in recent years, it has also been framed as another terrifying tale of being a young black man in America. It's a story that we are more attuned to today than people were at the time. It exemplifies what happens when African American men are in places that are understood to be not for them by figures of authority. In that sense, it feels like a very timely and, unfortunately, a very familiar story. Thanks for watching.